Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the How to Succeed podcast. This is How to Succeed at Making Sales Training Stick with Hamish Knox, a longtime Sandler trainer from Calgary, award-winning trainer and author of Sandler books as well. And I'm excited to talk about this topic because there's this interesting sales training paradox where I always equate it to like driving with a police officer behind you. All of a sudden, you've forgotten everything that you know how to drive for the last 20 years, and you start thinking and overthinking everything. We're going to talk about how to overcome that and really make the sales training take action. This podcast, as always, brought to you by Sandler, the worldwide leader in sales management and customer service training. More information at Sandler.com. Hamish, welcome back to the podcast. Tell me a little bit about the sales training paradox here and what we're going to talk about this week.
Thanks for having me back, Mike. So the sales training paradox is everything works if it's implemented. And something that has come up recently, and it actually was started by a couple of sales leaders saying to me, do I have the right sellers on my team? And I was like, okay, well, let's really unpack that, because first of all, those sellers are human beings, right? Who have families and mortgages and hopes and fears and dreams and all that. And they also have to perform, right? This is not a permission to not perform. So we started unpacking it, and we've been working with these groups for, varying lengths of time, longer than 3 months, but shorter than a year. And as I reflected, what I realized was the sellers weren't necessarily implementing. They were coming to sessions, they were doing the self-directed stuff in Sandler Online, and they were implementing the stuff that was really comfortable, the really easy stuff. But when it came to implementing the stuff that really would help them differentiate on how they sell, not what they sell, setting the upfront contracts, beginning and end of every conversation, really getting into the compelling reasons for buying, quantifying them, understanding in advance what the buyer's willing and able to invest time and resources, understanding the entire picture of how they're going to select somebody, that wasn't happening. So the leader is seeing these sellers go into session on a regular basis, doing the stuff. Oh yeah, Sandler's great, boss. But then they're like, okay, except the results aren't really changing. So one of these things is not like the other.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack there. So we're going to do it one at a time: attitude, behavior, and then technique. Absolutely. My initial thoughts are there's just some interesting things when you start sales training is that it's messes with your head a little bit with the imposter syndrome that I've seen people who were once good sellers all of a sudden start overthinking it, like I mentioned, or they start cherry picking things like you said of, oh, I really like this because this is what I was already doing. And then they make it confused. Or sometimes when we learn about personality profiles or disqualifying and things, there's this tendency to like go for no and get it a lot. I know you and I have both experienced that. And so there's a lot of kind of speed bumps here that we can trip over as we get started. And I've also seen it where the opposite is true. So I don't want to scare everybody off, where my favorite story of all time, we had this guy that was in the similar situation to you. The owner came to us and they were like, he's been with the company 3 months. He hasn't sold anything. He's gone through foundations. We don't know whether we should move him on to the next step and keep investing in him or just let him go. And we talked him into taking the next step and engaging in President's Club and giving him like another 90 days. And what's amazing is he made his first sale and started selling that week because we changed anything about his training, but he was so worried that he hadn't sold anything that he was going to get fired that he was messing up the sales calls and being too desperate on all the calls to make anything happen. Once he realized he had another 90 days, he was able to relax and finally get some deals done. And really interesting things happen like that in our head. So when I say attitude here, what comes to mind for making sales training stick and making it helpful, not hurtful?
So there's a bunch, and the number one, and it's two parts. So I'll say both parts, and so everyone can resonate with them. So part number one is for the person learning. right? Seller, sales leader, customer service, project, whatever, is I have the right to ask. The second part is my buyer has the right to say no. Because there are no magic bullets. There's no 7 magical things that you can say to always get the sale or the meeting or the whatever. That's all nonsense.
Read that blog, yeah.
Yeah, so have I, 17 different ways. And so what if, again, everything works if it's implemented, but if I don't believe that I have the right to do it, if I don't believe I have the right to ask or the right to implement, I'm never going to do it because I'm already beating myself up before I even get in the ring. And we have to not be like, well, if I say this to Mike, then it's absolutely going to get the next meeting, because Mike is a human being who has his own hopes and fears and dreams and worldview and patterns of interacting with sellers that I am probably violating, for lack of a better word, because I'm not going, okay, sir, I'd love to send you a proposal and hope to hear from you never. I'm saying, yeah, Mike, happy to do a proposal, kind of curious, if you get the proposal and you love everything you see, what happens next? You're like, no seller's ever said that to me. So I have the right to ask. My buyer has the right to say no.
I think that's really great. Now, did you say there was 2 things, or those are both things at the same time?
So that one, the first one is 2 parts. There's a couple of other ones, but I figured you might want to unpack that one a little bit, because that is a big paradigm shift for a lot of our clients, is both sides, right? Not only believing that they have the equal business stature, they have the right to ask, but that also it's not some magic bullet that the buyer's going to be like, where have you been all my life? Here's my money. They're going to be like, yeah, that sounds great, dude, but how about you just send me the proposal?
Well, that's where I was going. And 2 things came to mind for me. One is, I think we want to continue doing what was working for us, and not all of a sudden, like, changing a golf swing, blowing it all up and starting over and forgetting how we sold in the first place, because that can really mess up our pipeline and sales pretty fast. But at the same time, we can't only do what was working for us. We got to have permission to try some things. So that permission to ask, to me, kind of translates into permission to fail here, right? We need to go and we need to try some new things that may or may not work. And just because a new sales training technique didn't work the first time you tried it, doesn't mean it's the bad technique or the wrong thing to do, right? That's really hard to figure out in your head.
Amen. And that's where, like, I was having a conversation with a seller a couple of days ago, and like, well, yeah, I mean, not all of the Sandler stuff works. I said, no, it all works. However, it's not necessarily a literal copy paste from what you hear in the session to what works in your world. Sandler said, I'm giving you sheet music and helping you make it sing in your world. And unfortunately, because our brains are wired to keep us safe, which usually means stuck, our brains are lazy. So the brain goes, well, Mike said this, so I'll say that. Oh, it didn't work. Mike's fault. It doesn't work. Whereas if we look at sales and really human interaction as a scientific method, right? I have a hypothesis. Mike is a qualified client. I'm going to run an experiment. I will ask a question that I heard in a training session. I get new data. Oh, maybe Mike's not a qualified buyer. Let me run another experiment and keep iterating on my hypothesis until either Mike is a qualified buyer and we do business, or he's not a qualified buyer for right now, and we're not doing business for right now.
Now, I know you've written some books on the subject and stuff, but when we get to behavior, this is what I think we're talking about. We have to do the behavior enough to find out if it's working and enough to get good at it. And so there is a certain amount of trial and error, testing, hypothesis, adjusting to get there. But what's your advice here in the behavior bucket?
So several things. The first one is, and I make this mistake continually, right? So my comfort zone is over here. And for those of you who are not watching, my hand's on the left side of the screen. And then where I want to be is over here, which is on the right side of the screen. Now, because I'm not necessarily the smartest person, every now and then, I will try to go from where I am to where I want to be in one move. And there's plenty of listeners who are nodding sagely going, oh yeah, I've made that mistake myself, right? So what we coach our clients to do is pick, what is the thing that is comfort zone adjacent? So the thing where you're like, okay, that makes me slightly uncomfortable, but not massively uncomfortable that when I go out in front of a buyer, I'm going to sound like I just went to sales training and have a shiny new toy to try out. So you're already awesome. Pick the thing that you believe is going to make you more awesome, that just makes you slightly uncomfortable, that you can deliver in a conversational way. And then only do that one thing. This is, again, where human beings tend to make a mistake. And you said it earlier is, I'm going to change everything. Well, then it's not scientific. Then we can't control the variables. So pick one of the things that is comfort zone adjacent and do it for maybe a week. Maybe it's 3 weeks. It's probably at least a month until you've actually had enough buyer interactions. And this will depend on how many interactions with buyers you have on a regular basis. If you're in more transactional sales, maybe it's only a week. If you're in much more of that enterprise type environment, maybe it takes you 2 months. I don't know. But you commit to doing that thing every time. And then the second behavior is debriefing every interaction with a buyer. So what went well, what didn't go well as it relates to the thing that you're trying. So not the overall call. We're going to narrow our focus down and just say, okay, for this thing that I'm trying, I'm asking, is doing nothing an option, right? That's one question that a lot of our clients find early success with when they start working with us. So I am just going to analyze what went well with is doing nothing an option in this interaction. I'm going to gather that data. I'm gonna iterate on my hypothesis. I'm gonna go out, find another buyer, and I'm gonna ask that question again. And so that's the second thing, is we gotta debrief, because otherwise we have no data to say whether it was working or whether it's not. And it's really just like, well, my tummy thinks it's working, so I'm gonna move on to something else. And that's not necessarily beneficial.
So the natural follow-up question there for me is debriefing with a coach or a manager or somebody that can give you independent feedback and evaluation, not necessarily just saying like, oh, I did it, and like you said, I think it worked, or I think.
So both and. So we tend to be our biggest critics, right? And high achievers especially tend to be their worst critics. So you might have said, hey, Hamish is doing nothing in ops. And I'm like, actually, no, Mike, well, what do you want to do, Hamish? Well, I think I got to start working with you, which actually has happened to several clients. And you're like, man, that was only a $250,000 order. I bet I could have got more out of it. It's like, okay, well, you got the order. Let's celebrate that, right? And at the same time, we want to be debriefing with someone who is either watching call recordings or going on field visits with us and doing that debriefing, because we do want that third party support for either side, right? Are we too hard on ourselves, or are we too easy on ourselves? Most of us fall to one of two extremes, and that person gets to bring us to the center and go, okay, Hamish, I think you're not as bad as you think you are, but you're also not as good as you think you are. So let's talk about, how you can iterate on what you're already doing and then grow and scale from there.
Yeah, exactly. And my next question then is the snap back. So I know you have written a book on accountability. Again, I'll just shout it out. But there is the other side of that personality. Like some people want to jump too far, and that causes them to snap back because they're like, oh, it didn't work and it was painful. Let me run away from that. But there's also where if we don't do enough or we don't create this habit out of it, sometimes it works so well that we stop doing it and we go, oh, we made a couple of sales. Now I got to get busy and service those sales. And we stop doing what was working. Can you help us out with that problem a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike, because we need to make the commitment not only to ourselves, but to someone else. So we talk about accountability, and there's plenty of studies out there that when we commit to someone else, like workout buddy is usually the cliche that most people reference, right? If you've got a workout buddy, whether you actually work out with them or not, but if you commit to someone else that you are going to exercise a certain length of time, a certain number of times a week, you are much more likely to not only start, but continue and eventually, expand what you are doing in terms of exercise. So it can't just be like, well, I heard Mike say that, so I'm going to try that. Like, no, write it down, share it with someone. In my book on accountability, there's a whole chapter on consequences. I am a big fan of positive consequences because the word positive consequence is actually neutral. I am cookie operated, as a lot of people know from maybe listening to the podcast before. So, for me, a consequence is I get a cookie. And by the way, listeners, it is literally a cookie that I get when I complete it. So
they stop saying cookies because I started this new diet this quarter, and I'm on the second day of like a juice fast. And I feel like we're speaking to me right now. I need more accountability. Okay.
So then and by the way, for some of us, we may actually need to give the other person the cookie. so that they can actually witness us doing it, right? So it's not just like, well, I thought about saying that to Mike, but I like cookies anyway, so yum, good for me, right? We need to actually do the behavior. So this goes back to, okay, what are our typical buyer interactions? How is this thing that I'm picking, this thin slice comfort zone adjacent, is going to actually pay off professionally and personally? And so like with the Sandler no pressure prospecting call, there are 7 steps in a Sandler no pressure prospecting call. And some of the listeners are counting in their heads right now to make sure they know all 7 steps. When we coach that, we coach our clients, do not do all 7 steps. Pick one. Because also, by the way, the nice thing about having 7 steps is you can say, oh, I'm doing step 1. The natural progression is to go to step 2 once step 1 is starting to work. So we really have to be clear with ourselves as to what thin slice are we going to do, and thin slice it group. Do not try to do everything at once. Thin slice it, comfort zone adjacent. How often are we going to implement it? How often are we committing to implementing it? What does success look like? This is very similar. I was on a while ago talking about trials and demos. This is really what we're doing. We're doing a trial or a demo on ourselves. So commit to what success looks like, commit to an accountability partner, and then commit to what is the next step. Because where we often fail, and this is the point you were making a second ago, is we say, well, I did that. Well, yeah, we checked the box. We did that. And we have nothing else to go to because we didn't define it in advance. So if we define it in advance, we are much more likely to continue the progression as opposed to rolling forward and then stopping.
That's amazing. Now we get to the technique bucket, and there's lots of ways we can go because you've already shared several techniques from thin slicing and accountability and debriefing and others that we could use here. But what about maybe making techniques stick? So I find this to be very interesting is there's just so much, especially in Sandler. You've already shared a lot of tips of picking one thing, doing it at a time, and others. But does anything come to mind when I say the word technique here?
Totally. Well, and I'm also going to refer back to another podcast you and I got to do together on role play, right? The single greatest way to develop is by role play, because the hardest 4 inches to move in our life is brain to mouth. And all the knowledge in the world is useless if it just lives in our brain and it doesn't change the way we behave or the way that we communicate verbally with the people in our lives. And so leaders listening, role play with your people one-on-one every single week. Role play is a private activity, is not necessarily a group activity. You can do it in a group. It's much more effective one-on-one because the anxieties that are inherent in it, role play, are amplified in a group. So if we do it privately, one-on-one, we can also tailor it to the person, because you, Mike, might be awesome at the first 3 steps of the no pressure prospecting call. So with you, I can just focus on step 4 and 5, 6, 7. Whereas I have a more junior person on my team who's really working on 1 and 2. They got 1 pretty good, but they're really not that good at 2. So I can spend time with them working on getting that up. And then in a group setting, you're not rolling your eyes like, oh man, do I have to listen to this, this junior stuff? And the junior person is like, oh man, I haven't even got that. I'm going to tune out. So role play is number 1. The other one, because some of you are like, I don't have someone to role play with. Absolutely fair. Shadow box. So I trained Muay Thai for 10 and a half years. So shadow boxing. Shadow boxing is role playing with yourself. So you play both sides. And again, we tend to be our biggest critic. We also tend to be our biggest enemy when we are shadow boxing, because we invent the boogie prospect who doesn't exist. If you can consistently shadow box with the boogie prospect, anything that your buyer in the real world says to you is going to be completely simple. So those are the 2 key things on a technique side is role play if you can, or if you can't. And even if you can role play, shadow box is really powerful.
That's really good. I would add my own personal tip here. We talked about picking one thing at a time, but what I found is thinking about these situationally, that a lot of people, again, try to change everything all at once rather than you're not even supposed to do it all at once.
No.
Dave Matson's told a famous story of him in the car with David Sandler where he was like, oh, you didn't do any of it on that call. And Sandler just said, oh, you're a bully. You're trying to use all these moves every single time with every prospect just so you can beat them up and say that you did the moves. Yeah. And so I'd love to hear you talk about the difference between using a system and being consistent with what you're doing versus doing the same thing every single time or trying to use all the moves, because some of these and a lot of our rules are rules because it's if this happens, then do this. So if you're under attack, then fall back. If this prospect is negative, go more negative. And so we're not using every move on every call. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that actually, that is a really big frustration for me is when, and I did this when I first started in Sandler, I'd hear David Sandler on a recording say something, and I'd be like, I must say that. So I'd go out and visit with a buyer, and I'd say it, and they'd look at me like, you just went to sales training, didn't you? You've got a shiny new toy to try out. Now, they wouldn't say it, but everything about their body was like, no, this is gross. Can you just like back off? And so Sandler is meant to be conversational, right? That's our new rule in how to sell the modern buyer is sales is a conversation between two adults to get to the truth. And so ultimately, like I've shared recordings of my calls with my team, and sometimes they're like, did you do anything? I was like, I had a conversation, I got to the truth. And yes, if you want to go frame by frame, you can probably pick out where I was using those techniques. Ultimately, going back to something we talked about earlier, we have to be focused on the other person. We have to be focused on supporting our buyer from where they at to where they want to be, not necessarily where we want them to go. Because if our buyer starts to feel like we're shoving them down an alternate path, we completely break rapport and we lose all of our credibility. So ultimately, the things that we are sharing with our clients, whether it's in sales development series, sales leader growth series, organizational excellence, it's in our rules, it's in a self-directed course, those are mountaintops. And how we get to the mountaintop is different depending on how your communication style is, what the situation is. There are no magic bullets. There are no save me, because it's a human interaction, and every interaction is going to be different. Even if I meet with you, things are great, and we sit down again, well, you're not frozen in carbonite between our meetings, to use a very current Star Wars reference. And by the way, oh, look, you just brought Dave in. Well, who's Dave? And what does he care about? And so now I can't get caught up in the like, oh, I was trying to get Mike across the finish line, and now I have to be like, okay, new situation. I am present. I'm focused on my buyer, and I want to meet them where they're at now and see where they want to get to. And by the way, if I'm not a good fit to guide them along that path, I'm going to tell them that, because that's going to raise my credibility too.
I love it. Good stuff this week from Hamish Knox, longtime Sandler trainer from Calgary, Alberta in Canada. How about that? Also, you can go check out those books we mentioned. You can, search Hamish in your podcast directory, find a lot of other episodes. We've had them on here. But so, Hamish, I think I've asked you all of my questions. But since we talked about implementing one thing at a time, what's the one thing you're working on right now?
So the one thing I'm working on right now is actually the transition of my longtime associate Nisha to president of Sandler Calgary. So that was announced at the Sandler Summit back in March, and it's and also talking about doing everything at once. I also hired someone in January to take over my calendar, and I'm still managing my calendar. So clearly, I'm not. I haven't developed that. Working on it, right? So I'm really, the one thing I'm implementing is how do I trap myself into doing the things that I should be doing, which is focusing on supporting our clients and growing the business at Sandler Calgary, and letting the individuals that I've hired who have expertise that I don't to do the things that I shouldn't much more effectively. And so that's really what I'm working on right now. And it is a big transition, because, May 11th was my 13th anniversary in Sandler. And I've actually been working with Nisha for twice as long as I was working by myself. So it's a pretty cool journey that I'm on right now.
Amazing. Super fun stuff. I'll give you one last crack at this question, or a favorite, Sandler concept or rule here, but anything I should have asked, or something that you wanted to share with the audience while you got the mic and the camera on?
Thanks for the opportunity, Mike. The thing I will share with all the audience, and especially the leaders who are listening, a leader's number one job is to create clarity. and a human's number one job when we're interacting with another human is to create clarity. And unfortunately, we've been socialized, especially in North America, to create ambiguity and not necessarily speak plainly. And something that I have learned, in the past, when we're recording this, about 8 months, on the personal side, is we are allowed to speak clearly, and we are allowed to say what we need and what we want. And this goes back to something that I mentioned earlier about, we have the right to ask, they have the right to say no. And so leaders, especially when you are supporting your team members or you're rolling out a new initiative, if your team members are not changing their behavior in the way that you need to, that's caused by a lack of clarity. That's on us as leaders. And so it's not why aren't they getting it? It's why didn't I communicate it? Or how have I not communicated it clearly? And what do they need from me in order for them to adapt their behavior to what I need it to be going forward?
I love that. Great stuff today from Hamish Knox. You can find him in Calgary. Enterprise team. If you have multi-locations, multilingual teams, and you fit the enterprise model, reach out to them as well. As always, hit subscribe, share this episode with somebody that you think needs to hear it. It sounds like a great starter for somebody getting into your team and getting started with Sandler training. So don't snooze on that. Until next time, whatever you are, be a good one. We'll see you, everybody.